Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Southeast Media Sunrise, dedicated to giving a voice to authors of all genres. I'm your host, Jodi Hockinson. Joining us remotely by phone today is Alan Geik, author of Glenfiddich Inn. Alan Geik grew up in the Bronx, New York, and graduated from the City College of New York. He received a Master's of Science degree from London School of Economics and Political Science. He was drawn to filmmaking and became a film editor and worked at Wide World of Sports in New York. After moving to Los Angeles, he was hired by Paramount Pictures as an editor and worked on a number of iconic films. For 25 years, he hosted a music show on KCRW in Santa Monica, one of the largest public radio stations in America, as well as a popular weekend show at KXLU, a Los Angeles radio station. In 2000, he produced and financed two music recordings, Caravana Cubana, called Late Night Sessions and Del Alma. Late Night Sessions received 2 Grammy nominations. Welcome, Alan, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jodi. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Likewise. So tell us, why did you choose World War I as a backdrop for Glenfiddich Inn?
When I was in school, in graduate school in London, I was struck by how profoundly effective World War I was on Europe, particularly on the British Isles. And it didn't have that effect in America because we weren't in the war for as long. And the war started basically as a skirmish between a couple of old kings on the continent. And before long, it became the most devastating war in human history. And the British Isles were devastated. Every town in Scotland, Ireland, and Great Britain were just denuded of their manpower. Men were lost by the tens of thousands. And also in the United States, I was aware that before World War I began, we were a debtor nation to Europe, to the banks in Scotland, the Netherlands, England. And by the end of the war, we became the creditor to Europe and a world power in those 4 short years. And they always say Rome wasn't built in a day, but basically United States power and economic and political power were built over those 4 years.
New York and Boston are the settings for the novel. What interested you about these 2 cities?
Well, I grew up in New York, and both New York and Boston were the closest connected to Europe, particularly Great Britain. Both cities, and all big cities at the time, their inner city population was Irish and German, Jewish, Italian, but largely an Irish population that had a great dislike for the Brits, of course, who were their colonizers, and the Germans had the same kind of dislike for the British. So there was a war within a war in America to keep us out of that war. And finally, after 2.5 years of the war going on and devastating Europe, we were dragged into it. But it was also the 2 biggest seaports that were connected to Europe, so they were very much aware of what was going on in Europe. And also, I was doing a research on Carlo Ponzi, for whom we know the Ponzi scheme was named. And he was living in Boston when he pulled off this scheme. And I was doing research, and I realized how rich Boston was in culture and technology before the war and as the war progressed.
One theme is the early days of experimentation in wireless auto transmissions that became known as radio. What were those days like?
That was one of the reasons I picked Boston as well, because Boston had a experimental college station, radio station, and it was developing all over the country. But the idea of having a voice being transmitted even 1 mile into the New England frigid, cold night, into a living room on a farm where someone can hear a human voice, or even a concert, was so unique and revolutionary. we think about it, throughout human history, there's rarely ever been a stranger in someone's home, coming from so far away. Right before World War I began in 1914, 2 years before that, the Titanic went down, hit the iceberg, as we all know. But the Titanic had something aboard that was revolutionary, and it was wireless Morse code. And they were able to send out a signal for ships to come and pick up the survivors. If they didn't have that ship, the Titanic, would have been lost at sea, as ships have been throughout human history. We wouldn't have had any stories about the band playing on deck and the individual acts of heroism and bravery and cowardice and everything else we've heard over the century after that. So once that happened, a lot of people said, well, what happens if we could do that with the human voice? And that was the beginning of radio. It was originally called wireless audio transmissions, but the name radio stuck to it and became, as two of my characters, two women, were immediately drawn into the idea that radio could change human history, which in fact it did.
You were a radio host for 25 years. Did that experience make the early days of radio of special interest to you?
Absolutely. And I immediately, once I was doing research into a totally different story and started to read about the beginning days of radio, I realized from my own experience on the radio how inside the head we are of the listeners. And I mean, before internet came around, or even while it was developing, people had radio in their bathrooms at the beach. They used to walk around with boom boxes. They knew the people's voices. People knew my voice. I was shocked. I had never intended to be a radio host, but there were people who would call me up and say, are you okay? You don't sound well, or you sound a little distant. They were that tuned into the shows they were interested in listening to. So how it all began and how it developed was of great interest to me. And I was immediately drawn to the characters who were actually proponents of radio and suffered the contempt of the people around them who thought it was never going to amount to anything, much like people did 80 years later with the internet. The same question came up with radio. How, if it's free, can you make any money off of it? Nobody thought of advertising until it was well into being in people's homes. In the same way, people ask the same question of the internet 80 years later. How do you make money off of it if it's free? And now we know how internet has become wildly successful financially.
Novelists have said their characters often go off in directions the author didn't intend. Did you experience this?
That's a really interesting question, because as I was writing the novel, and I had never done one before, I was interested in other authors and how they approached writing a work of fiction. And several authors talked about the characters actually taking the writer on the journey. And I said, oh, that just sounds too romantic. That sounds too far-fetched. But lo and behold, as I was writing it, in fact, the characters were taking me into places that I had never imagined the day before that I would be writing them in to those situations, into those historical situations. And that was the biggest thrill and surprise of writing the novel, that the characters had voices that spoke to me.
A reviewer described two of your fictional characters, Margaret and Helen, the women who were strong advocates of radio, as Katharine Hepburn characters. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And it's sort of funny because someone who wrote a review of it characterized Helen and Margaret as Katharine Hepburn types, and I never really thought of that as I was writing it. They were so far evolved from the usual portrayal of women or women's roles in that day, even though, as we all know, women have always had courageous creative roles throughout history. But Margaret and Helen, they both were involved in a family that was a progressive publishing family at the time. And the family said, well, if everything you think about radio happens, we won't have a newspaper because people won't pay the 2 cents for the newspaper. They'll listen to the radio. And they were so far thinking, their thought was so far evolved that they just withstood all the pressure from the men, mostly around them, who just derided their strength, their creative sense, their foresight is the word I'm thinking of, their foresight about a technology that the men around them were totally deadened to.
That's fascinating. So who is the most interesting character to you?
That relates sort of, who was the most interesting character? That sort of relates to the characters taking me on this wild journey that lasted as I was writing the book, because different characters became fascinating to me as I was writing it. But the 2 women, Margaret and Helen, because of their attitudes towards the culture around them, towards their own sexuality, towards their view of politics, were interesting throughout. And there was another character who was somehow based on Joe Kennedy, the father of the president, who was a philanderer and the most amoral person in American life at the time. And the character Joe Kennedy was not completely in any way modeled after him, but he was an amoral character as well, who was a bank president, who would just as easily rob a widow's pension money as he would set up a huge stock scandal that was huge, involving tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, which was huge money at the time, as he would take a few dollars out of a widow and orphans fund from the bank. But at the end of the day, and I don't want it to be a spoiler, but at the end of the day, his character spoke extremely loudly to me. And within a day, he had a completely different role in my story, and one that amazes me to this day.
Babe Ruth plays an important role in your story. How did that happen?
Well, I grew up by Yankee Stadium, and I was very much taught the legend of Babe Ruth, even though that was before my time. But Babe Ruth came to Boston coincidentally the month that World War I started, August 1914. He was 19 years old, and he came from a workhouse in Baltimore where he had spent 10 years. He had parents. They owned a bar on the docks of Baltimore, but he was incorrigible, so they put him in a workhouse. And when he was 19, he had such skills as a baseball player that the Boston Red Sox took him on the team. But he was also naive, and he was the biggest player on the team. He was naive. He had never seen a menu. He had never been on an elevator. He bought a bicycle with his first paycheck. But over the next 4 years, as the war progressed, so did Babe Ruth. And by the end of the war, he became a metaphor for the war and for America for me, which I had never expected, because by the end of the war, he was already agile in fixing baseball games, which were done more often at the time. And he was a philanderer. He had a cynical edge to them, although I must say he was never a bully in his life, despite his size. When he was in the workhouse, he was always a guardian to the smaller children, and he remained that way throughout his life. But he was nonetheless a metaphor for changing over those years to something that was much more sophisticated in a not always a socially acceptable way.
You were a film and video editor for much of your career. How does that affect your writing style?
That's interesting. And again, I never expected it. But as I was writing, I was realizing that when I was editing, if I was editing a movie or scenes, that you have to go back and keep continually rewrite them and re-edit. And the idea is to make the story move forward, make the story as brilliant as you possibly can. Take out every little frame that is just a little glitch in the story. It had a profound effect on me as I was rewriting the story. First, it was a rush to get everything onto paper, but as I would go back over it, I would realize the editing skills I had in an editing room were totally applicable to what makes a story bounce off the page, which I hope it did, as much as I would if I was working on a film. And when you have a film, you have other people's input into it, directors and producers. So you're always kept on edge, but the combined goal is always to keep the story moving forward in as vivid a manner as you can.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. Anyone interested in purchasing this book can log into semediapodcast.com or visit amazon.com. It's available in Kindle and paperback, and you can also visit Alan Geik's Facebook page at Glenfiddich Inn. That's GLENFIDDICHINN. Again, this has been Alan Geik, author of the riveting, fascinating novel Glenfiddich Inn. Thanks again for joining us today, Alan.
Oh, I can't thank you enough, Jodi. Thank you for having me, and all the best to you and your website.
Oh, thank you, and the pleasure was all mine. And listeners, if you're interested in getting your book published, please visit us at semediapro.com and click on the book publishing link. This is Jodi Hockinson, host of Southeast Media Sunrise, Southeast Media Productions. Like us on Facebook at Southeast Media Productions, or visit our website at semediapro.com.